Hello there, John Culturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, thank you to everyone who makes my work possible. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that what you find in the media or on the internet is not advice. If you have concerns about yourself or someone else for any reason, please seek the advice of a professional or somebody else that you trust. In today's episode, I'm going to be discussing one of the most significant subjects of concern for me and relatedly one of the main problems that I observe in society, and it's our need, both individually and societally, for standards and norms, and how it is incredibly important for us to have standardized and established ideas about what is suitable and objectively good behavior and what is ineffective, unhealthy, or bad behavior. Societies strongly need this to operate, and it's important for us to not just consider society, but also how we embody this within ourselves. I need to make some factors clear before we begin this discussion. First of all, the criticisms that I'm going to make are not levelled at any one group of people. They're levelled at society at the broader level, because quite frankly, we as a society do not have particularly good standards, and that happens across political, religious, cultural barriers. This is not an attack on any one group. As a species, we tend to be lacking in this area. We are capable of improving, and that's why I make these commentaries, but this is something from which everybody can learn. It's also not to say that you are a bad person or somehow less worthy if you are living life on an erroneous basis, or if you're living life in an unhealthy or ineffective fashion. The reason I make these commentaries is not to blame you, and it's not to say that if you don't have healthy standards that you are necessarily less worthy. The reason I make these commentaries is to make you aware of how we are all flawed in some way, so that you can take this knowledge and then improve upon yourself. Because human life does have inherent virtue, and you are worth investing the time and effort in order to improve yourself. Not just for the benefit of others, but for the benefit of yourself. You get to reap the benefits of that as well. Much of how we live our lives is also taught to us, and there is a lot that we can't learn except through experience. So when we are born into the world, if we don't have caregivers, personally and professionally, for example, our teachers, who provide us with the right experiences, in many ways there are certain nuanced domains of life that we can't be expected to learn alone. We have to learn them through experience. They're not taught to us, and we are not taught practical psychology as a society. So it's important to understand you're not a bad person, but we are all flawed in some way, and it's important to be constantly willing to reflect on how we're living our lives and what we can do to improve them. What I also need to make clear is that this is not political rhetoric. I do not make any commentaries from political or ideological standpoints, and it's important that we recognize that this concept of standards and personal discipline and holding ourselves to high regards and encouraging people to follow what is objectively good and discouraging people from following what is objectively bad has been, this approach to thinking has been used in the past for the wrong reasons. It has been used to oppress people with authoritarian intentions. For example, in parts of the world, at some point in history, and perhaps even today, there are established standards that say that if a woman wears a dress, it must be below her knees, or her swimsuit should not be too short. All these types of ideas are postulated in the guise of objective reality and what is objectively good for society. But as I have said, just because an idea posits itself to be objectively true, and just because society has a high level of order created by the standards that we set for it, it doesn't mean that it is objectively in people's best interest. People are oppressed by this type of talk. People have been admonished and excommunicated from groups, been thrown out of their home as children because their parents or the people looking after them decided that they were going to bind themselves to a set of standards in the name of obeying objective good and objective truth, and people ended up suffering as a result of not only recognizing that those ideas were not objectively in people's best interest, but at the same time not something that they were willing to abide. And it's important that we have nuanced minds and distinguish between these ideas that are postulated for the purpose of oppressing people and for the purpose of allowing certain people and certain groups to have control over others, and understanding the objective psychology of how we work individually and societally and why we need to foster standards in order to function optimally. It is also possible, not as common, but albeit possible, for us to think that we're doing what is in someone else's best interest by encouraging them to obey what we believe is a set of objectively good standards, that then ends up becoming a power game in which we become so convinced that we know what is in their best interest that we become combative when they don't agree with us, and perhaps abusive. That is also a possibility. Again, constant self-reflection is so important. We need to know why we are doing what we are doing. There are such things as objectively good standards, and there are such things also as setting standards that are more arbitrary, but at the same time, they're not harmful, and when obeyed, they do create the sense of order with which our minds work most effectively. I don't like to brag in any way, but I was considered when I was quite young a classic overachiever, and in my later years, I've had supervisors tell me that they think they'll learn about organisation and good standards from me. I'm flattered, and I like that people are affirming that I'm doing my job well. At the same time, I don't like the underlying psychology of this. What it subtly suggests is that people think good standards and good performance are a privilege of the select few. I'm going to explain why this is so significant in more detail later, but this is not the case. I am not a superhuman. We are all capable of doing more than what we actually believe we are. We just haven't been taught it. Once we learn how, we are incredibly capable. To start this discussion, we're going to discuss first some basic psychology. Our minds function on a number of basic principles, and some of the most fundamental principles are the types of assumptions we make about the world, often implicitly below our conscious awareness, and also how we process information about the world. As I have stated previously in my episode about human nature and the essence of human nature, we need to survive, and we are designed psychologically and physically to facilitate survival for ourselves and for other members of our species. Part of survival means being able to focus with as few worries as possible and as few discomforts as possible. On an unconscious level, it's theorised that we know that life is quite complicated and in a literal sense can be quite dangerous. So what we often do at an unconscious level is we interpret information and create ideas and concepts in order to distract us from that. And those include binding ourselves to ideologies and frameworks that we convince ourselves explain the objective reality of how the world works, and then create through that an illusion that the world is an orderly place. If we know the ideology in its entirety, if we obey all its rules, then the world makes sense and everything fits together in a nice, orderly fashion. We often interpret information in ways that fits that ideological framework to maintain the illusion of the world being orderly while ignoring everything that refutes its validity. At the same time, we also tend to become combative and defensive against anything that threatens that sense of safety, including people disagreeing with us. Another tendency from that of wanting to maintain a sense of comfort is rationalising away the need to self-reflect and take personal responsibility for certain problems, because personal responsibility takes effort, it takes sacrifice, and that is not comfortable. So we try to rationalise why we don't need to do that because we've obeyed the rules of our ideology, we don't need to go beyond that, or alternatively, that problem wasn't mine, it was someone else's. While I've always argued that objective reality does exist, our mind does have a set of limitations. We don't function well without a set of guiding principles. And everything from the to-do list that we write every day, to the routines that we set for ourselves, to the laws of our society, to religions that have helped to build civilizations, they all act on a similar component of our psychology. They create guiding principles. If we have a set of principles by which we can decide how to live our lives, not only do we live life more consistently, it maintains that sense of security in the consistency. It also saves us a lot of time and allows us to be more constructive, allows us to achieve more, because you'd be surprised how much time we waste just asking what to do. At an unconscious level, we also have a set of assumptions about life, and assumptions are effectively ideas that we hold to be true, but without actually verifying them perfectly in every case. I'll give you a simple example. The fact that you right now are able to leave your home and get in your car if you drive, and drive to the shops, and know that you could do that if you wish to do so, that is based on assumptions that are not held consciously for the most part, that you are capable of standing up out of your chair, if you are capable of doing so, unlocking the front door, stepping outside, closing the front door, walking to your car, getting in your car, driving to the shops, and being able to execute that without having an accident. It's not often spoken out loud, but if you genuinely did not believe that, even implicitly, you would not be able to leave your home and drive to the shops. Because if you genuinely believed that it was so dangerous to undertake such a simple, even that simple of an endeavour, you wouldn't do it for fear of causing a threat to your survival. And for almost everything that we do, we hold these implicit assumptions. When we assume something is true, it allows us to approach daily tasks without having to establish the scope of our capabilities. How cumbersome would life be if every time you wanted to drive to the shops, you had to think to yourself, now I have to undertake a full-scale analysis of whether I can get up out of my chair, whether I can walk to my car, whether I can drive without having an accident. Life would not be feasible and you wouldn't survive because you wouldn't be able to take the necessary action. Having a set of guiding principles helps to satisfy our minds and keep them orderly in the same way that those assumptions do. Another way by which we decide how to best deal with the world and how to best make decisions is by comparing the decision we are currently making to a similar decision or a similar situation. And that is the mechanism by which the slippery slope happens if we don't establish sometimes rigid but at least firm standards. Then when we change those standards, or we allow those standards to change, then we are more likely each time we face a similar situation to be comparing what we are proposing to do in the present to a standard that has constantly changed every time we've referred to it. If we have a firm standard, then we are more likely to approach life with consistency and consistent quality because that standard does not change and we are always living up to or aspiring to achieve that standard. When we form beliefs, often those beliefs are not necessarily critically analysed. We take mental shortcuts. Often they work and they do allow survival. Also often, however, we choose our belief based on how they fit our worldview and through that, how comfortable they make us feel, how secure they make us feel. But the sense of security, as I said, is not always real. It's our mind trying to distract us from how dangerous the world is. When we make decisions based on whatever beliefs, ideas, concepts, and other mental processes we've undertaken and created for ourselves, and we make actions based on those decisions, we set in motion a process known as reciprocal determinism. And how that process works is when we act, those actions affect not only ourselves but the environment, and we observe the consequences of those actions, and then the consequences influence how we think and feel about the situation. Those thoughts and feelings will then influence how we choose to undertake the same or alternative actions in the future. Ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, and the environment all influence each other, but they influence each other in different directions. So, for example, when we undertake certain actions, that influences how we think and feel about ourselves, which in turn will influence further not only how we think and feel about ourselves in the future, but also what actions we choose. When you observe the consequences of certain choices, certain ideas, phenomena, choices, behaviours, lifestyles, etc., do objectively have more benefits than others. You can't always quantify them, but if you take a very nuanced, qualitative analysis of how certain choices lead to certain outcomes, you will find, if you're being honest with yourself, that certain choices do have better outcomes than others. Sometimes they're because they tend to our natural needs. Other times, those choices may be relatively arbitrary, but having a firm standard allows us to maintain an astute quality of thinking. Or sometimes a certain choice may be objectively good in some situations, but objectively bad in others, based on how it's implemented. So we need a set of standards by which we judge what is healthy, and we need to set ourselves a promise effectively that we are going to have the discipline to pursue it, regardless of whether or not it feels pleasant. Because if we don't have those standards and we don't achieve them, we're not going to achieve an optimal life, because our behaviours will be guided not by what we have specifically chosen for the inherent good, but we're more likely to be making arbitrary decisions based on spur-of-the-moment thinking. That's not healthy. Yes, not everything can be orderly, and spontaneity is healthy in many aspects. I've discussed that in the past, but in our life, we need firm standards. The problems are that reality, as I said, is hard to define. It's qualitative. It can't be rule-directed. You can't simply say that a given rule applies to every situation in every domain of life. What is good in one situation will not necessarily be good in another and may require different thinking. But what is objectively good in each of those millions and millions of different situations and decisions which you find yourself facing does exist. And there are some decisions that are better than others. The other problem is that if we have to tell ourselves, I don't have high enough standards, I need to improve, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have with yourself, and it's an uncomfortable conversation for someone else to have with us. Often we avoid, as I said, discomfort because it threatens our sense of security. So it's often easier for us to simply change the way that we perceive what we really need and what's objectively good so that we don't have to conform to as high a standard as we would otherwise have to. So we often make a mistake in operationalizing. We change the standards and say, well, these lower standards are actually acceptable because, and then compare our performance to those standards and say, well, I'm meeting the standards, therefore I'm doing well, without regard to whether we have actually set the standards well, whether we have actually objectively analysed whether these standards are firm enough and of a high enough quality to achieve a practical outcome that is favourable. What we find is that if we set standards in most of the areas of our lives and we seek excellence, we seek to be the best that we can be in every possible domain, it actually trains our mind to be more astute and to be more high performing. We pay greater attention to detail, pursuing excellence, especially in the domains in which it is most important, like in your work and in your study and in your pursuit as a family person, for example. That becomes more habitual to you. It becomes easier to execute the behaviours and the decisions that constitute good performance in those areas of life. When you train your mind to seek excellence, even in a seemingly insignificant area, you're setting a precedent for yourself. When I can take control and achieve an objectively better outcome, I will. And having that as a habit is absolutely crucial, but we're not taught it. As a counsellor, I receive referrals from others, and I also like to help my audience become aware of resources and other providers which may be beneficial, as well as help other individuals and organisations gain exposure. That's why I host the Your Listener Partner Network, and I'd like to thank my partners for their support. I'd like to introduce Kay Crow of the Love Life Counsellor. Kay Crow provides online relationship counselling across Australia for singles, individuals and couples wanting to overcome barriers to connection, resolve conflict, repair attachment and build healthy relationships. With 8 years' worth of experience in mental health, Kay has seen how relationship difficulties can impact well-being. She helps clients explore patterns, attachment styles and emotional habits to create meaningful, fulfilling connections through a nurturing and inclusive approach. Find the Love Life Counsellor at www.thelovelifecounsellor.com.au. Let's discuss some of the domains of life in which these issues tend to manifest. We're going to be talking about what people may tend to do or not do, the ethos, the spirit, the mindset that people tend to be taught and then embody. Note that any of these standards alone in isolated incidences wouldn't indicate low standards, but I see all these happening in society on a regular basis. That indicates that they're not isolated incidences. In totality, it indicates that as a society, we need to hold ourselves in high regard and aspire to greater standards. In no particular order, let's talk about education and work. The entry requirements into certain educational courses and certain fields of work, for example, in emergency services, have lowered over the years. Now, the problem is that in the past, people were prevented from entering a lot of these occupations because of identity politics and discrimination. For example, women weren't allowed to enter the workforce into certain roles in certain times and places in history and in some places of the world even today. What we then did was a classic example of taking things too far. We said, because people have suffered oppression, not only are we going to allow them in, we're going to lower the standards so that other people don't feel bad about not being able to enter. They've made it about feeling good, not about the objective requirements of the role. Think about, for example, being in the military or being in the police. There used to be greater height, weight and fitness requirements. Those requirements were more likely to be met by men That doesn't mean that there are not women that cannot be good police officers, and it also doesn't mean that if there are women who can, that they shouldn't be allowed to. Your qualities and competence should be the sole determinant of whether or not you can perform the job. But the objective facts, whether you like them or not, is that people who need police intervention, violent criminals, they are not going to care whether the standards have lowered, and they're not going to be nice to a female officer as opposed to a male officer. They will continue to be violent. The reason that we need those standards is because the objective realities of the job don't change. You may have to physically confront someone in order to prevent them breaking the law and harming other people. You need people to be able to meet that requirement, and changing the standards in the name of social justice is a complete fallacy, because it's not to say that women are inherently less worthy if you say that we need to meet a certain standard, and it just so happens that men are the members of our species who are more likely to be able to meet them. Yes, it is oppressive to say you cannot enter this job because you are a woman or because you are of this group or that group. It's not oppressive to say you must meet these physical requirements regardless. And both people I've known and I have witnessed incidences in which, because of the lowering standards, we've seen people in public service not be able to cope with certain situations. In the past, it would have been a case of they wouldn't have even been able to enter into those professions. If you prohibit someone from entering a profession on that basis, you're not saying they're not worthy, you're saying you're not suitable to this job. And in the name of trying to self-pacify and say, oh yes, the world is a safe place, see, we're fair to everyone, we actually delude ourselves by telling ourselves, oh no, you don't really need those standards, they're just oppressive social constructs. And I'll give you another example. I couldn't be a brain surgeon, I don't have the stomach for it. That line of thinking effectively self-defeats the intention of civil rights movements and social justice movements. The spirit of it and the real utility of it was that you should not be judged by your group membership that has nothing to do with your ability to perform a certain role. Just because you can't meet a standard because of your natural characteristics, for example, you're not big enough to be a police officer, it doesn't mean that you cannot make incredibly valuable contributions in other areas of life. I couldn't be a police officer, even though I'm a man, and I'll gladly admit that. It doesn't mean I'm less worthy, and it doesn't mean you're less worthy either. Standards in work, in terms of what is acceptable conduct, has also, quite frankly, lowered. And again, this is not to insult any one particular group. Overall, I see this. In terms of how people dress for work, in terms of the type of language that they consider to be appropriate for work, in terms of how they communicate with their clients in way too informal a manner, in terms of the level of effort that they put into work, in terms of what they consider to be a solid day's work. Related to this is in terms of communication. Now, communication and language only are as effective as the amount of agreement we have on the meaning of certain words and certain language norms. If you are constantly changing the norms of language arbitrarily, or you're not conforming to them, then other people can't be expected necessarily to understand you. But at the same time, we should know how to speak and write in standard formal business English when we are in business. We need to know how to write business letters. A lot of people don't know how to do that. A lot of people don't know how to engage in organised communication. All too often, you give a message to someone, either spoken or written, and they disregard most of what you say and then respond ineffectively to the points that they did manage to detect. I've seen examples of the ethos, for example, in certain online forms. The form won't work if you use a semicolon in the message field. I have more to opine on this similar concept in just a minute, but effectively it seems that certain norms and certain language symbols are completely alien to some people, or at least haven't been considered as necessary in the realms of communication. People using emojis in work emails, no offense to you if you do, but I don't consider that business practice. We have problems in terms of what we consider to be acceptable behaviour, and all too often we tend to be accepting of behaviour, or at least not critical of it, for fear of judging the individual engaging it. We need to make some things clear. Regardless of how you perceive something, certain behaviours will cause damage or can be destructive. And just because you are judging a behaviour, it doesn't mean that you are judging the individual or saying they're not worthy. You're saying this behaviour isn't acceptable. And in most cases, the individual is capable of more. I can't say too much about this due to confidentiality, but I'm seeing instances, for example, of children being exposed to absolutely horrible things in their homes, including with regards to drug usage, and people in the social services sector being afraid to mention it because, oh, it's not our place to judge that they're using drugs. No, you don't want to stigmatise someone or make them feel horrible, but drugs are unsafe, and regardless of what your beliefs are, that is an objective fact. If you are affected by drugs, you are less likely to be able to act in a manner appropriate to raising children in a healthy fashion. When you have children, you choose that lifestyle. You have a duty not to introduce them into a world in which they're going to be harmed by your actions. You have a choice to change, and you can change. But it is not acceptable to evade the truth because someone else is afraid of how it sounds, or it might hurt someone's feelings. The truth is the truth, and sometimes it just can't be disputed. It's also similar in terms of the types of behaviours that people display in public. When I was in high school, there were all sorts of sexually explicit behaviours on public display amongst my school peers. It was considered acceptable, and what's more, people who would otherwise be arguing about misogyny and about sexism seem to find it hilarious. Boys will be boys is not an excuse. Oh, they're just kids is not an excuse. There are plenty of children who don't engage in those behaviours and who grow up respectable. Why? Because they're taught the right standards. We have problems in terms of personal organisation and personal responsibility, our roles in certain interactions. Is this you? Have you been in business and had people saying, I need you to remind me of something? Me, it goes straight in my calendar and I take responsibility for reminding myself. How many times do you have people arriving late for meetings or not being able to meet appointments persistently? How many times have you found that your work colleagues have made mistakes that then cost you time because you have to correct them? I see this all the time in reports that I read from other professionals, in ways that I see other professionals practicing, in the workplaces that I've been in. Some people's mistakes have impacted others because they don't pay enough attention to what they're supposed to be doing during the day, and other people have to spend time correcting them. In all too many workplaces that I've seen and in which I've been, people are satisfied with good enough. They're satisfied with mediocre performance. They're satisfied with, this is how much I'm paid, therefore I'll just put in the minimum amount of effort. And if you've been a customer of a business, you'll often see this in terms of the attitude of the people who work there. It's very laissez-faire. They don't sound particularly interested in you. They don't sound particularly attentive to you. People think, well, this is my job and I'm not paid very much, so I'll just do the bare minimum. Or people not being familiar with the products and services with which they work and that they provide. And again, not being willing to learn more. Not being willing to have excellence in customer service skills. Professional reports not having very much detail or being done with very little effort. People don't often understand the rules and the standards that are considered acceptable in the common pursuits that they pursue. For example, how many people don't know what road rules are and don't take responsibility for learning them properly? How many people don't know how to effectively control a car? I'd say probably most. Yes, you might be able to drive and have a fairly good chance of avoiding accidents, but why not learn to be the best driver you can? One of the most formative experiences in my learning to drive was actually an old instructional video that I found, and again, this is not advice of any kind, but it was by former Formula One racing champion Jackie Stewart. It was a video called Behind the Wheel, and he described finer techniques about car control. And for example, he described how to best sit in a car to be able to stabilize yourself, how to hold the wheel properly, how to operate brake and throttle so that the car stays perfectly level and you obtain maximum grip on the road so that you can steer more accurately, and so that if you have to make an emergency stop, you're less likely to cause an accident. And the type of mindset that involves thinking ahead and being observant of what other drivers are doing so that if somebody else does the wrong thing, or so that if an unexpected event takes place, you can act well in advance and prevent an accident. How many people actually take that level of thought in their driving? Some people with all the automated features in cars don't even know where the controls are for the headlights because they assume the car will do it for me. Even something as simple as taking attention to detail in how you write, making sure there are no spelling mistakes in your messages, paying attention to everything that someone tells you and responding in kind, assuming everything will be all right, something else or someone else will take care of this for me. I don't need to know this, there's a computer that will do it for me. All of these detract from the pursuit of excellence, whereby we actually develop our own knowledge of how to do something ourselves. We have problems of standards in terms of resilience. We often engage in our popular culture in what is called avoidance coping. That is to say, if something makes us uncomfortable, rather than seeing it as an opportunity to face a challenge and potentially make ourselves more resilient against the difficulties that exist in the world, we say, I'm just going to not engage with it. And often it makes its way into governance, in which we ban, for example, the public use of certain words that make people uncomfortable. You'll often see this also in those reaction videos you might see on social media, in which people are reacting to events, footage, other films, and they seem absolutely shocked when horrendous things take place. The fact that so many people seem shocked by even a curse word, and I don't believe in swearing myself in my professional sense, but in the end, a swear word is not going to hurt you. It doesn't sound nice, but hearing that is not the end of the world. And if you genuinely react that aversively to it, there are probably worse things in life that are going to affect you. A vital domain in which we have problems is holding ourselves in high regard. The significance of this will come in just a minute. You see people, again, not dressing themselves appropriately for work like they used to, not taking the time to really nurture their minds and their bodies, not looking into how they can be the best versions of themselves, also talking down about themselves. For example, in business interactions, people saying, oh, sorry, I'm a hot mess, sorry, I'm not very good at this, I'm not very good at that, constantly self-deprecating. Now, I've had people tell me, John, all these are very complicated issues. You can't say that they're all part of the same source. That's only half right. Yes, all of these may result from a variety of different sources, but they all relate to a similar psychology and all have similar consequences and all point to a similar common problem. And I'm not suggesting also that it is necessarily the individuals who create the environment. Sometimes our culture creates the environment in which people not only are not taught to set high standards, but also aren't given the appropriate resources to be able to meet them. For example, when people have too many demands at work, more than what they can realistically handle, they're less likely to have time to spell check, and that's where mistakes happen. I'm not suggesting it's just an individual problem, but when you overcomplicate the matter and say, oh, there's all these philosophical nuances and social constructions that mean that these are not problems of standards, they're problems of this or problems of that, you make an excuse not to address the problem. And the problem is, certain things are better than others, certain ideas are better than others. We should strive to be the best that we can be. And we should strive to help other people be the best that we can be, not just by giving direct guidance, but by providing them the platform on which they can actualize those good standards. Remember what I said about reciprocal determinism. People might say, well, dressing formally for work is just social constructionism. Objectively, it doesn't matter what you wear to work, because trying to control people's sense of dress was just a social rule that people invented in order to control people. Yes, technically speaking, clothes are arbitrary. In a literal sense, yes. There is nothing that makes a blue shirt more formal than a red shirt. But the thing is that even when it comes to manufactured norms, if we practice those norms for long enough, they come to hold symbolism, they come to hold a meaning, and then they become so much a part of how we live that not working with them can actually leave something missing in the way that we psychologically function. People sometimes say, I'm too formal, but I can tell you not a single client has ever said that. When I go to work dressed in my business attire, I'm not saying I'm better than you. What I'm saying is, I recognize that this is a workplace. Someone else is laying down their hard-earned money to receive my services, and I intend to not only provide you with professional service, because I can't provide you with the right services if I'm acting like your friend, being casual, being chill, so to speak. I need to put myself in the mindset of being a professional to give you exactly what you've paid for and to provide you what you objectively need or subjectively need, but to provide you what you need, what's in your best interest. But at the same time, by dressing myself that way, I'm sending myself a message. I'm saying, John, you are now ready for work. That influences my mindset, which allows the cognitive resources that are necessary for me to do my job well to function more effectively, which then provides the quality of service that clients find satisfactory. That produces the results that are objectively good. Clients are happy, I'm happy, and I continue it. In all of these cases, if we decide for ourselves, yes, I'm going to follow what is objectively good. I'm not going to smoke marijuana in front of my children. I'm going to drive properly and safely. I'm going to dress myself properly for work. I'm going to make sure there are no spelling mistakes in my reports. I'm going to make sure that I communicate with people properly. I'm going to constantly think about the consequences of my actions and make sure that what I do is going to have the right consequences. Not only are you producing a direct objective benefit for those around you and for yourself, what you're also doing is you're influencing your mindset and encouraging your mind to seek excellence and to challenge yourself in other areas of your life, which you can then do because you demonstrate to yourself that it is possible through the actions that you have already taken. And this is not just for the benefit of society. When we do it collectively, it's for the benefit of society. When you do it individually, it's for the benefit of you. And we all have pursuits that are meaningful for us. This isn't just about feeding the capitalist machine that is work culture. This type of thinking will foster your personal well-being. And what's meaningful to you in life, you can pursue with greater constructiveness if you choose that mindset, because then your mind is more attuned to what you need in order to be successful in whatever you choose to pursue in life. I'd like to make an additional commentary with regards to artificial intelligence, and I discussed this recently in a podcast collaboration, and artificial intelligence in itself has brought benefits, but the extent to which it is being used is an example of falling standards and us labeling it progress. What many people are saying is, in the future, if you are not familiar with AI and don't know how to use it, then you will be left behind because it will become a need. I made clear the facts of it. It is a manufactured need. I'll give you some examples. There have been people who have mistaken the way I write for me being a bot or being artificial intelligence. Facts are, I don't write using artificial intelligence. Never have, probably never will. One of those people was a neuropsychologist. What that says is people are so used to artificial intelligence producing clinically precise product and have not been educated on how to communicate properly that when they see clinical precision, they see a bot and don't know that a human being not only is capable of producing that, but should produce that to keep their mind optimally attuned. Sometimes what people do is they use artificial intelligence to explain something that they don't understand themselves. And then they give the information to someone, and then someone else asks them, well, where did you get this information from, and how does this explain your point? And they don't know how to respond to that because they haven't bothered to actually teach themselves the subject matter. People use it as a substitute for human interaction. I know some people suffer chronic loneliness, I'm not judging them, but there is no substitute for human interaction. Sometimes things should remain the same as they were. Sometimes we should conserve tradition. Sometimes you should do things the hard way, so to speak, because there is no other way to keep your mind attuned according to natural law than by using it and challenging it. Artificial intelligence will wither that, except if you're someone who happens to be a computer programmer, in which case you're constantly challenging your mind in the work that you do. But even those people may still get lazy in other areas. I'm not suggesting that the old ways are always better, but we lived for years without it, and people did things successfully, had successful relationships, were successful in their work and in their other pursuits. It's possible, and what's more, instead of raising our expectations because we now have an easy way to do things, keep the expectations reasonable so that we can do things the old way to keep our minds attuned. That's how we should be taking care of our minds. Your mind is not going to take care of it itself. If you want to follow that mantra of trust the science, as they say in popular culture, this is what you have to do. Understand that whether you like it or not, your mind needs your attention. Give it the attention it deserves. You are capable of it. And what we often do is we evade reality when we're faced with these truths. What we've done over the time is we've redefined what is acceptable so that it is easier to achieve, when that's not what acceptability is meant to be. You're meant to label something acceptable when it objectively serves the true purpose that it's meant to. You're not meant to define what's good by what's easy for you. You're meant to define what's good by the practical outcomes that it has. We also tend to redefine what we consider to be quality, or what we consider to be needs, or what we consider to be a reasonable source of responsibility or action. By making the standards easier to achieve, we give ourselves the delusion that, oh, life has gotten better because we have these new, wonderful ways of doing things. Life has become easier. And because it's easier, it must be better because it maintains that illusion of life being a safe place. I'll give you some examples. We have shorter attention spans. So when people talk about content creation, they say, people don't want to listen to long-form content. Make it short and sharp. Now, that's always been the case, especially in domains like sales. But what we're actually subtly implying when we say that is, people have actually evolved beyond needing long-form content. Well, that's not true. If you want a proper discussion on something, you're going to have to read the whole article, you're going to have to listen to the whole content, and it has to be created by a human mind doing critical thinking. The fact that things are shorter to tend to your shorter attention span doesn't mean that your needs have changed. You not wanting to concentrate for more than 5 seconds is not a need, but we treat long-form content as if it's daggy, as if it's nerdy, as if to say, oh, that's for nerds, that's for academics, who wants to listen to or read that? Well, if you want the full story, you have to read it or listen to it. If you want a shortened version of it, you're not actually getting a more advanced phenomenon. Marketing and content creation hasn't become more advanced. We're not more progressive as a society because of it. We're just responding to people's laziness. Sometimes we interpret confidence as toxicity. You may have known someone in your workplace who is always focused on their work and is always very particular about when they ask something, they want it done soon, and they need straight answers from people and they give straight answers. Yes, there is such thing as being a narcissist and being toxic, but all too often, I'm willing to predict that what people see in a toxic person is actually their confidence. They tell it like it is because sometimes reality and life demand it. I've had plenty of contact with relationships with others, my professional life and my personal life, had plenty of contact with businesses where people being politically correct, so to speak, and trying to dance around the truth rather than saying it outright is associated with a mindset by which people are not focused on the job. If a person comes to you and needs a straight answer, it's because they're focused on getting the job done. Yes, people can be toxic, but what we often interpret as toxicity is not toxicity. It's someone knowing life has demands, I need to meet them. Let's get something done now, let's stop procrastinating. Again, you're not wiser than Mother Nature. Nature creates us, nature has laws, reality has demands. Yes, we can be compassionate in our pursuit of meeting those demands, but demands are still going to be there. When I was in high school, one of my companions was very quiet and very diligent. They liked to just sit and do their work. They weren't raucous. In a particular subject in which we had to undertake a group assignment, I observed this person trying to encourage the group to get on with the assignment and do their best, and the other group just didn't want to be involved in it. They were plain out being rude and lazy to them. So my companion said, well, fine, if you don't want to work, I'll do it. In their report, of course they passed, but in their school report, there was a comment made, this person doesn't work well with others. Social constructionism doesn't change reality. Just because you interpret that being nicer to children who are raucous and being quite frankly destructive and dangerous in their behaviours when they get physical in the classroom is a nice way to treat them, doesn't mean that objectively it is not better to just sit down, shut up and do your work. And often it's the children who want to learn who get punished because we're too afraid to tell children who are being raucous to discipline them. I'm not suggesting being violent, okay? I've always said you never be violent with children, but you have to show them reality. In real life, you must do things. Life has demands. And regardless of whether you think they're fair or not, they're still going to be there. If you want to fail in life, fine, ignore them. If you want to have a chance at having a good life, be sympathetic to them. But instead, we lower the standard of what is acceptable behaviour and then say, oh no, these children being raucous weren't behaving badly. This person was behaving in a toxic fashion by being unsociable. The fact that you redefine what is good behaviour doesn't mean that objectively what good behaviour is changes. We also see this in education, something that I'll discuss more on a future episode, whereby employers are requiring higher qualifications, for example, master's degrees, and we interpret this as us being a cleverer society. But what we've done is we've shifted our perspective by requiring those high qualifications and saying, see, people are more highly qualified when they are actually learning less than what they did in lower qualifications of yesteryear. The qualification title is a social construction. What you actually teach is the substance. But by changing the names, you delude people into thinking that they're actually better. Well, as I've said many times, I've come across many mental health therapists who are doctoral and master's qualified, and their behaviour is shockingly dangerous. And what's more, the academia accepts it as safe. An argument that I'm sure people will make and have made is this is conservative propaganda. That's false on a number of fronts. Number one, the fact that something is associated with conservatism doesn't mean that it's a conservative idea, and it doesn't mean that someone espousing it has the same intentions as, for example, a conservative rhetorician. Remember, often these ideas have been pushed in the past because they benefit the people pushing them. I don't want to see society become an oppressive place. One of the best ways to make sure we don't fall subject to someone else's oppression is to make sure we don't fall subject to our own. If we don't hold standards, we oppress ourselves. If we hold ourselves to firm standards and we set an example that we are worth striving for high performance, then we liberate ourselves. Something else that also needs to be understood is that when we want progress in society, which we should want, assuming we define progress as positive change, constructive change, if we don't have standards, we won't achieve it, because we need to, number one, decide what is appropriate by our standards, and we can use those standards of appropriateness to then protect people and stop the ills. I'll give you an example. In the past, rape within marriage was actually not a crime. A man could legally have sexual intercourse with his wife without her consent, but not with a woman outside of marriage. That was still considered rape. If you don't set a hard standard, sex without consent is rape, then people will start looking for excuses to exploit people sexually by justifying, no, it's not rape because I'm married, or it's not rape because she didn't explicitly say no. We need standards of acceptable behaviour, otherwise vulnerable people, which are largely meant to be protected by progressive theory, can easily be exploited. We have to have laws about exploitation. No, you cannot pay someone below this amount. You cannot force somebody to work too hard or else fire them. You cannot abuse child labour. If you want progress, we need to hold ourselves in high enough regard to decide there are certain things that are objectively good, they're objectively good for us, we are worth holding those standards, and the people whom we are protecting are worth us holding out those standards for them. There's still a lot of leeway in terms of what's healthy, but there are certain areas in life where you really do need to set standards. It shouldn't be because it makes anyone else feel good, it's because you achieve better outcomes. And if you do want to care about other people, setting standards for yourself allows you to be the best person that you can for them. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, if you have concerns of any kind, please seek advice from a professional or somebody else that you trust. Do not take what you find on the internet or in the media as advice. And if you have been inspired by something that you've heard on my program, if you'd like to come onto my show to talk about a subject, if you'd like to give feedback, if you'd like to suggest a topic, or you'd like to even disagree with me, I welcome guests from all walks of life, of all voices on my program. I'm keen to examine what you have to say on these types of subjects, and I'm sure I will learn something from you, whoever you may be. So thank you for listening, and until next time, take care.